plenty more on the website, so I'm not going to talk too much about the Strategic Management Forum right now. I'll go straight into the topic for this evening, which follows on from the 4 blog posts that I produced, which seems like a long time ago now, back in January and February. I wrote the 4 articles introducing the concept of valueism, which really is defining or arguing that business should be focused on value creation, and that every organization should be focused on value creation, however you define value. So let me just ask the audience a quick question. Would you agree that the purpose of every organization, business or organization in any sector, should be creating some form of value?
Yes.
Okay.
You want a show of hands as a straw?
So I'll come back to defining value, but so I think the audience agrees, and every time I've asked that question to any audience, it's not very controversial, the idea that every organisation should be creating value of some form or another. The big question really is, what do we mean by value? But I think you'll be quite surprised to learn, as I was, that in a global survey conducted by McKinsey of 700 board members of large corporations internationally, only 22% of the board directors actually believed that their fellow board members had a good understanding of how the organisation they're directors of created value. So that raised alarm bells in my mind, and I thought it was quite a terrifying figure. It begs the question, how good can their strategies possibly be if they don't know how they're creating value? And then it led to some other questions, which were, if they don't know what value they're creating, they can't know who they're creating value for, or how they're creating value. And to me, those are the 3 fundamental questions of good strategic management. But it's quite interesting. Let me ask the audience another question. The organisation that you work for, do you believe that the directors of it understand the answers to those 3 questions? What value do the organisation create? Who for? And how are they creating that value? And I'm not expecting you to answer, certainly not publicly anyway. But I've asked that question to senior executives of large organisations, to large institutional investors, to heads of strategy of large corporations. And not one single person out of the hundreds that I've asked that question to believes that the boards of the companies they work for can answer all of those 3 questions. So that's really quite worrying, but I think it actually gives us reason to be optimistic that there's massive room for improvement in terms of the ways in which organisations are run and how much value they could possibly create if they understood the answers to those questions. So let's just look at those 3 questions in a little bit more detail. What value does the organisation create? I would argue that most organisations automatically default to thinking of value in only monetary terms. Value for money measured in terms of maximising profits or maximising shareholder value seems to be the default. And it's really not surprising that that's the case, because we manage what we can measure is the phrase that everybody's heard many times. And standard accounting processes only actually measure value in financial terms. So there are many initiatives that are trying to now work out how to measure the non-financials in business. But there's no common standard that's yet widely accepted of how to measure the non-financial elements of value that a business is creating. And so I think it was Martin Wolf, Financial Times columnist, said that, well, if what gets measured gets managed, Martin Wolf argued that basically we just ignore the stuff that we can't measure. And I think that too often is the case. The question about value for who? Okay, so all customers should be the first priority, whether that's customers, clients, or whatever. And we should be talking about value for all shareholders. That's actually now recognised in the new corporate governance code. So that's not a controversial point these days, but it's not actually what's practiced in most cases. And I would argue that we need to adopt a new mindset to the whole approach to thinking about value and value creation in business. Many of the problems that we experience are because we need to bust some of the myths. One of the myths is the idea that there's a fixed amount of value in a value chain and we need to compete for the largest share of it that we possibly can, and that therefore it's a zero-sum game. It's not. We need to think about value as an ecosystem, not a value chain. We need to think of it as a positive-sum game, and we need to move from competition for the largest share to collaboration and co-creation to actually create more overall value that all of the players involved in the process can get a larger share of. So, okay, I'm going to get to the end of this. I would basically just say very quickly that I think the new kinds of thinking that we need are design thinking, constructive conflict, which is avoiding the need for trade-offs, integrative thinking to come up with solutions that are win-wins for most stakeholders. We need to adopt a different approach to leadership, which means power with rather than power over. And we need to look at what Mary Parker Follett called plus value, which is the win-win value extra. Those ideas are not new ideas. Mary Parker Follett was writing at the turn of the century. So if you want to find out more about any of those concepts, just refer back to the articles that I wrote back in January, February. And I think that just the last few points, we need leaders with a new mindset. We need an ability to make better decisions. We need well-designed systems of systems. We need good relationship management inside and outside the companies with all of the stakeholders involved in the ecosystem. We need excellent communication. We need an ability to manage across silos and across organisations. And we need to know better what we should be measuring in order to make sure we're managing the things that matter. And I would suggest that the new place to look for answers to some of these is the disruptors and the digital age, the new platform operators. Platform business models are based on many of the things that are the new approaches to thinking. Right, I'm going to move on. I didn't realise that it was going to take me quite that long to go through those cards. And I'll invite Andy Wilkins to reflect on what I've just said.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. Andy Wilkins, CEO of BeAdvisory, a strategy consultancy looking at sustainable value creation. So, thanks very much, Paul. That's kind of laid out a landscape in which you so articulated the lack of appreciation of value in boards, and that's probably manifesting in how organisations behave, which yields, as you say, the positive idea that there's much more value on the table. I think this is a really interesting time to be alive when historians in the future look back at this stage. We're at the dawn of the biggest transformational changes in technology that the world will ever see. We're undergoing a transformation within our culture in which our organizations and trust in institutions is falling. We've become much more transparent, much more accountable. Expectations are higher. So advocating and implementing any form of change is being done in a context which is radically different from that which we may have learnt previously in our career. So building on Paul's points, there's just a couple of things that I'd like to build. One is, how do we think about identifying value if it's so poorly understood at the moment? And I'll do this very quickly. There's one approach that I found throughout my career is incredibly valuable, and that is an approach made famous by Clayton Christensen, which is called jobs to be done. And when thinking about any innovation or any project, it's worthwhile noting, and as we'll hear later, I think some of the stats on the success rate of projects, even in innovation itself, 90% of innovation fails to achieve the business goals set for it. So there's a huge failure rate in our ability to transform, whether it's through innovation or system processes. And one of the interesting insights is the reason for that level of failure is not that we're good at developing stuff, it's because we'd never understood the nature of the problem we were trying to address well enough. So we can perfectly design a solution that fails to hit the mark. So Clayton Christensen's jobs to be done framework is really interesting because what it does is ask the key stakeholders, which could be the customer stakeholders, other stakeholders, what is the job you're trying to get done to which this innovation or this project will act as the solution? It's different from asking people, customers, what they want, because when you ask people what they want, you smuggle two questions in there. What is the job you're trying to get done, and what do you think the solution is to your own job, which then become the requirements for the project. So pulling those apart and saying, what is the job you're trying to get done, leaving all solution stuff off the table, allows you to get deeply into who are you doing it for, what context is that happening, what triggers that job, how does it start, what does it end, what are the steps in between. And through those precise inputs, you can start to build a deep understanding of what it is that the project is looking to achieve. And it will have functional elements, it will have emotional elements, it'll have social elements. So it's not just purely functional, it's looking at the whole gambit. This provides a precise set of inputs that I think offers three major benefits for projects. One, a deeper understanding of how value will be created for the audience to which this project is there for. Secondly, as the project goes in flight and adjustments and changes and decisions need to be made, there's a much richer set of inputs in which to make those decisions around articulating the details of a project as and when it is executed. And thirdly, you'll have a richer set of metrics by which to evaluate has the project actually achieved value. So this way of using jobs to be done thinking to excavate and articulate what value actually means, not only for the end beneficiaries, but for all stakeholders, allows us to map these different factors together and gives a much more powerful framework to understanding what does each stakeholder value and how do we articulate that and ensure that that is captured and managed throughout the duration of the project. I'll leave you with one final benefit of this, and this is more pertinent to the work I'm doing right at this moment, which is this approach also is extremely valuable when looking at massive system transformation. So I've been recently involved in writing a report for NHS on what would healthcare look like in the next 10 to 15 years, and what would that call upon from in terms of all the actors of the healthcare system to come together. So by looking at the trends that are likely to play out through the radical advances in medicine, technology, sensors, AI, etc., rolling them forward and imagining what that would look like in 10 to 15 years' time. What is the job of looking after someone's healthcare? All those factors come together at the individual body. What does that look like? And therefore, what does that then mean for all the siloed actors all dealing with a piece of that at the moment, if they can have a shared vision of a long-term future? This is incredibly powerful because it helps each of the actors to see what they're doing in the next 0 to 5 years in the context of a much bigger end game. It provides a kind of North Star from which a whole ecosystem can start to aggregate around. But beneficial to both the healthcare system as well, but also articulating and expressing and revealing where are the areas of collaboration, cooperation with industry and the third sector, who all hold valuable pieces of that end jigsaw. So I'll leave you with that thought, and thank you very much.
Okay, and now I'd like to introduce Mark Worrall, MD of Lean Construction International.
Okay, good evening. So my background is mechanical engineer, a manufacturing background, came into construction about 10 years ago, and in that sort of manufacturing world I have been through a good dose of some Japanese engineering training, and now we're bringing that to the construction sector. We are going through a bit of an identity crisis in terms of the words lean and construction, because lean means certain things to some people, and really when we say construction, I mention that and people think we only turn up when the things start to get dug, built or put onto buildings. And that's not the case. But just going, my way of work, or our way of working, always starts with that first question of what is value? You know, why am I here? What do you want from us? And I guess that's now expanded with, as we're just discussing, or has come through the panel, in that there's so many people or so many stakeholders that are involved in that sort of question. Even sort of yesterday, my wife explaining to the Ocado delivery driver who said his utility bill was quite high, she explained to him it was actually the lowest utility bill he got across all the utilities, and living in Coventry wasn't he very lucky to have that. Why was that important? She says because they get measured on perception of the public just as much as they do on the deliverables. But I was always trained and made to look at, you know, there's a big difference between when we're talking value, but seeing value and seeing waste. And we don't always go about our daily lives and see waste and see what's valuable. And it's a very challenging question for people when you actually say to them, I'm just going to do an analysis of when you're actually adding value and when are you not adding value, and do you know some of what you're doing is very wasteful. I won't dwell on the strategy side of things, but we have to spend a lot of time doing this with our clients to get to that point of them knowing actually what are we here trying to achieve. But for us as well, it's to make it all very visual. I use a lot the principle of shadow of the leader. You know, you are what you say, you are what you do, and people follow what you measure and prioritize. And we want the leadership to very much create a framework where people can be making improvements. So I'll use some of our usual more nuts and bolts methodologies. So we do the value stream mapping, because if we can't get it up on the walls and we can't see what's going on and everybody actually see how things are made, then we don't actually know where they're adding value and not adding value. Whilst we do use design for manufacturing assembly principles, we take it all the way through to actually operationally, the buildings cost just as much or even more to run as they do to build in the first place. So now, there's all the digital systems, but for us you can't escape getting stuff out, getting stuff visual, getting teams engaged, and actually doing some hands-on activities. When we're asking clients what's valuable, we're also getting drawn into social value now a lot, which is hence partly, you know, lean and social value. You might say, well, what's the relationship? We're getting a lot of activities around that, because we also, as you were just saying, look at the well-being of the individuals and the development of the people, development of their thinking, development of their capabilities, and development of how teams work. The social side of it is really important. So even if of the three categories across economic, environmental and the social side, economically people want to include more small SMEs in major projects. That can be quite complicated, but we would be looking at, okay, where in those value streams can they fit? Where can they pick off packages of work, and whether the systems are distributed all over the country or located in one area, how can those SMEs be engaged? When we're doing problem solving, we want diverse teams in a room. We don't want a bunch of guys who look, you know, the same as me. We've got to have all sorts of people to get all those different perspectives of the right sort of solutions. And then for us as well, when we're looking at things from an environmental point of view, we're working closely with a couple of logistics companies around not just the value stream going down, but how do we go up as well? How are we looking at how we get parts or products to sites and recycling the packaging, not words, recycling packaging, so that we're getting kits of parts delivered to site. We're getting recycled use of containers. And I think one discussion we had earlier, a principle we use is we feel at times that we're only skirting the surface of what's above the waterline in terms of what are we looking at in terms of value. Going back to my point about are people really seeing what's possible, and we do use I do use a term of the art of what's possible. You know, we just don't know what we can achieve until we've really unearthed everything and had a real good go at it. I often get challenged by people who say, how are you going to improve our programs by 20% or productivity by 20%? And we often do. So just to wrap it all up, not just are we looking at those tools and techniques, but it's creating an environment where people think differently, we can do creative problem solving, they can see what's going on, and we are tackling the big issues, the small issues, and the medium ones on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis to tackle those value statements. Sorry, that's a little bit.
Excellent.
Okay, let me just introduce Greg Lawton, CEO of Nodes and Links.
Hi everyone. So before I get into this, just a very quick show of hands. Who's here from government? Amazing. And who here is from industry? I guess everyone else. Okay, so we're very, very government heavy, and that's what I expected, because a core understanding of value is really from the purchaser's side, and the questions that aren't monetary are very much government focused. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually give a perspective that may give you evidence of what value is that isn't monetary. So you can take that away, think about it however you wish. Now before I do this, I want you to just keep into your mind the concept of jobs to be done and the concept that perception matters just as much as money does. Now the question is, how do we define and measure the value of major projects beyond money? Now the answer to that for me is that major projects deliver value through the provision of capabilities that impact the personal utility of current and future populations. Now I'll expand about that in a second. So deliver value through provision of capabilities impact personal utility across time. Now the core first statement of that is around, well, what's this personal utility thing I'm talking about? Well, that's a recognition that we actually live in a complex world. And a complex world is one where a lot of our systems are interconnected, dynamic and large, and these create emergent effects that blur the boundaries between cause and effect. Now, in these systems, there's a core rule. Local rules drive global effects. And I'll give an example. Your personal beliefs on immigration, on fairness, on employment opportunity, on time to commute to work, all of these personal beliefs will have impacted your vote in Brexit. And it's the individually held beliefs that actually define what value is. Now that leads on to the next very core concept, that actors like the economy, or the business, or the project, or the enterprise don't actually exist. They're representative agents of all the thoughts, opinions, and desires of the people that operate them. So actually asking the question, what value are we creating? Well, then we have to focus on the individual person and the individual people. For example, HS2, we need to increase the prosperity across the north of England, and we're going to do that by cutting journey times between Birmingham and London. If you live just outside Birmingham, does that actually give you a better standard of life? Does that actually cut the cost of you going down to London? Or will 5G negate the fact that you need to travel anyway? These kind of questions. The second come on to that then is, well, why do we use money all the time? Well, money is fundamentally a substitution of value. I think about it this way as, it is just a record of the favours that I have done for people and the favours that people owe me. And it facilitates third-party interactions. That's fundamentally all it is. So the obsession with the value of major projects being money is fundamentally just our own inability to actually think about what matters to other people and what jobs we have to do and how that matters in the grand scheme of things. Now, to bring that whole philosophical argument together in, well, what does it actually mean? Capability. Who here, just one last show of hands, who here knows of the concepts of capability? Graham, expect your hand. There we go. So capability is the power or ability to do something or to effect an action. And it's a very core premise of how the British military actually conduct all of their purchases, operations, etc. We're very fortunate that we actually live in a country that is world-leading in that regard. So they regard capability, they break it down into 7 fundamental areas that allow them to understand what the fit of everything comes together. And those 7 areas include infrastructure, it includes equipment, it includes logistics, it includes personnel, it includes training and doctrine, it includes all of these things. Fundamentally, they're answering the core job to be done question of what do we need to do to maintain the sovereignty and peace of the United Kingdom. Now that core thinking is fundamentally how we then define the value of project. So just jumping on to some quick wins and actionables that I believe we can take now. The first is we need to start accepting and educating ourselves in the fact that we live in a complex world and that breaking things down into digestible components isn't an accurate model of how the world actually works. It's more driven by the interconnections than it is about the individual parts. Major projects are almost a perfect example of this. The second is that business cases need to focus on the benefit to individual people and their individual lives, not to some ethereal concept like GDP or the economy or growth. Now, more long-term things, and it's more of a challenge for a challenge against all the government departments that are sitting here. If the reason that we do these major projects is for prosperity and it's to increase the standard of living and the benefit of the people, everyone who sits in this room and everyone in this country, why are questions around what people care about and what people want and what people don't want not part of the national consensus? Who can tell me who here cares most about education for children? Or who here cares most about the development of transportation, etc.? It's all an individual thing, and when we come to elections, we group them all together into a, do you support this party or that party? So to summarise that, I'd say that major projects deliver value through the provision of capability aimed at individual people, both now and in the future. And that is a different mindset than just looking at the monetary.
Okay, I think I've got a task of trying to summarise briefly what's been said. So I would suggest that the issue is we need better ways of defining what value actually means. We need to be able to answer those questions of what do we mean by value, who for, and how are we trying to create it. The problem really starts at the start, I think, with the definition of value, but complexity with the number of stakeholders that now need to be considered in the whole strategy, planning and implementation process is making the whole issue all the more complicated, but all the more urgent. Okay.
Excellent. Good. Well, you've had some interesting perspectives there, and I'd like to throw it open to the audience for questions or observations in terms of the projects that you work on and your views on value and the role that value plays in how those projects are initiated or delivered. So, some questions. Yes.
Well, very interesting actually. My name's Graham Copland, and I think it's an observation and a question, if that's okay. But the observation is when you talk about values in relation to major projects, I mean, in some respects, it's just values in relation to any business. I attended the other week a very interesting seminar with some entrepreneurs, and the successful ones started off by saying that they organised their companies, and their total sort of focus of the company was on some kind of noble purpose. That actually they were geared from day one towards doing something good for what would end up being their client base. And I was quite taken by that, because I think in the projects that I've been involved in, very easily in large organisations, you get rather inwardly focused, and you start thinking about the outcome in terms of KPIs, rather than looking at, well, actually, is this doing good and recognisable good to the people that are actually really trying to affect? So my question really is, should every organisation, whether public or private, have a noble purpose? And should that therefore be the catalyst for driving value, identification of value?
I'll have a go at that. Absolutely yes is the answer to that. It's very interesting what you described. Startups usually have a very clear picture of why they exist, what value that they're delivering and for whom. And what happens when organizations start to grow and become successful is that you have to recruit more people, you have to devolve some responsibility, you start to create departments and sub-departments, and lo and behold, that integrated, unifying purpose starts to get fragmented into a number of different silos and departments. So silos start to build where each person in each silo, if you like, is doing their task and doing it as well as they can. But now no one in the organization has the shared purpose as the governing principle of why they're all there. And so what happens is that bureaucracy starts to take over. It becomes inputs and outputs and metrics, and the organization itself loses sight of what it's there to achieve. So reinstalling or making sure that purpose there is the organizing force, if you like, that galvanizes everyone towards why are we here? What are we looking to achieve as our organization? Which is a motivating force. But secondly, having a shared language to talk about their organization, which can act as a bridge across the silos. So there can be cross-silo conversations about achieving that purpose. Without it, business tends to fall back into bureaucratic delivery and loses sight of that very thing you mentioned. So it's a good observation.
And a way of summarising that, I think, is the means become the ends. So you lose sight of what the ends really are, and you're focusing just on the means, because they're where the KPIs are that you're going to get measured on. And I think that it's one of the ideas behind Valueism. Valueism is basically saying never lose sight of what value you're trying to create, and make sure everybody in the organisation understands it.
I agree with everything. I think that was just the point I was going to make. Everybody understands it, and it gets cascaded down to the individual, so everybody knows what it means to them, but they don't lose that sight of that. Oh, that's a nice term, noble purpose.
I was just thinking of an example I know of where that's been implemented well, and I'd say that's Google in China, where they entered the Chinese market to obviously become the dominant search player, and then when they were required to censor their platform that goes against their principle of make information universally accessible to all, they pulled out. And they could have had a lower business in China running, but they actually fully pulled out and said that's not what we're about. I wonder how many major corporates or departments would pull out of the largest market, second largest market in the world, because of what they stand for.
Okay, short answers and short questions. Yeah.
That's good. Merv, is there anything interesting coming in?
Yeah, we've got a few coming in. one specifically, I think, directed for Andy here. How do you manage opposing values from stakeholders within a project? Can values be compromised?
Good question.
It's not mine.
So I talked about stakeholders and the jobs they need to be done. There's obviously tensions will build between those competing requirements. So it may be that investors are looking to maximize the return, and while people responsible for delivering the value proposition may identify opportunities to create more value, which may reduce short-term returns but generate a longer-term relationship. So one of the things that we've looked at is understanding the value story from each of the stakeholders. Then there's a piece of work to be done, which is how do we manage those competing claims for value in a way that generates the best outcome for all. So there's an element of trade-off potentially, but this is where innovation becomes really important. Are there opportunities to meet the needs of different stakeholders in a creative way that avoids the zero-sum basis, that adds the opportunity for increased value for all? And that depends on the circumstances and the context that you're in. But there are opportunities with the right innovation, the right thinking, to be able to manage those competing claims to create the best outcome for all.
Can I just add to that briefly? I always argue that rather than talk about stakeholders, it's better to actually just use the word investors, because we're talking about people that have all got a vested interest in the future of the business. And if you look at them as investors, all investors want a return on investment. As an employee, that return on investment might be partly wages, but actually probably more important for many people than just the money is the opportunity, the ability to grow, the ability to be listened to and make an impact. And I think if we understand value in a broader context and what it means to each of the investors, then we can actually satisfy the return on investment requirements that they all want more effectively. And unless we do, then the business model probably over the long term isn't sustainable.
Good.
Sorry, I know that I'm part of the academy.
No, please.
It's just you picked from my specialist subject. But no, so a lot of the teaching we're doing here, or not really teaching insight, is about actually realising value from assets, which is a lot about what you've been talking about today.
Can you speak up?
Oh, sorry, value, okay? So a lot of what you've been saying today is about realising value from assets, which is a lot of what we actually preach through all our sessions in this academy for now. And the one document, if I was going to pick a document for everybody in this room to read, it would be ISO 55000 in the suite of documents, which is an asset management standard, which, guess what, is about realising value from assets. It's about alignment, it's about stakeholders, it's about leadership and assurance. Oh, sorry.
So that is a document that I would get everybody, literally, from every word I've heard today, to read. ISO 55000 management system document. It's been out 5 years, actually. So I'm sure a few of you have read it already. But, yeah, asset management isn't about managing assets. It's about realising value from them. And an asset is an object of organisational value. So that's the key point I want to raise there. So please go and read that document, because it tells you exactly how to get better value from your assets for organisations.
Did you catch that?
Yes, please.
From your perspective, are benefits the same as values, or are there any subtle differences? Because I know, like, obviously benefits is a word that we're used to using within government, within public sector. So I just thought it was probably worth, getting your views on whether that's the same as value, whether there are subtle differences. What do you guys think?
That's a good question. In traditional classic marketing literature, you will talk about features and the benefits that accrue from those features, and this is how you sell what you're doing to any particular audience. I think the difference we're talking about is that value goes much more fundamentally to what it is that the person is trying to achieve. So it's excavating what is the job someone is trying to get done, to which you may have a solution or a partial solution, and rather than claiming what are the benefits of my solution, is to look deeper and say what else could we or should we be doing to help that person or citizen get that job done. So it's a different notion of value, which is helping people to achieve the things they're trying to do. And by using, say, a jobs to be done approach, is a brilliant way of excavating what those are, to come back and look at the service that's being offered and say, are there gaps? Could we be doing more to help that citizen get that job done? And so extending or augmenting or improving the offer is the call to action, not simply repackaging of features and benefits back to citizens on something you've already built. It's much more fundamental than that.
Perhaps I should throw it open to members of the APM Benefits and Values SIG and say, go on, you've got both things in your name. Are they synonymous? What's the difference?
So I think there are probably a range of views within the SIG. So we've recently merged. We previously we had a benefits group specifically and a value group specifically. So this financial year, we've merged to become one. So from the perspective of value, I'd say the main difference is that you understand what it's costing you to achieve the benefits that you're looking to achieve. So, and that cost is not solely financial, but that's also in terms of considering the other resources that you're putting in. Whereas benefits is more about what are those desired outcomes that you're trying to reach without necessarily scaling it, weighting it in terms of what goes into achieving that.
Thank you.
So, hi, I'm Jemima from KPMG Major Projects Advisory, and I'd be really interested in the panel's views on the upcoming, there's a huge portfolio of... Hi, thanks. There's a huge infrastructure portfolio of projects which is being overseen by the Infrastructure Projects Authority. I don't know if it's represented here today. About £600 billion the government's going to spend in the next 10 years. What advice, given this discussion around value and delivery of value for a wider social purpose, what advice would the panel give people executing those projects at the earliest stages? What should actually be done differently at the early stages of designing and delivering those projects?
So I'll give a perspective of that. 600 billion is a drop in the ocean, is my perspective on that, compared with all the projects that are going to be done over the next 200 years. Now, if you look at the development of a civilization, it's fundamentally underpinned by the infrastructure that it builds. It starts with houses, roads, water systems, etc., etc. The growth in the standard of living, and if you're going to be as fundamental and rudimentary as GDP, is underpinned by these projects. Now, what I'd say is, it's a large investment. We currently don't, to the best of our ability, learn from all of these projects in the detailed nuance and pass that learning on. And we're about to make an investment of 600 billion, which, like I said, over the next 200-300 years will be a drop in the ocean. What can we do now to spend the time to quantify the benefits, and then what can we do to measure those benefits over the next 30 to 50 years, so that when our children and our children's children are coming to build their infrastructure, they can do it better, more productive, more predictably, faster, cheaper, all of these kind of things, and can fundamentally address the core jobs to be done. I'd say it's a change in perspective. It's not that much money.
I would absolutely support that, but add, as you could probably expect I would, to say, rather than thinking about projects that are going to deliver stuff that may or may not provide some kind of benefits to the population, which is maybe a traditional, although perhaps a slightly harsh way of describing it, to flip the telescope and look through the other end, to say, what are the core jobs that citizens need to get done to which these projects are being thought of as potential solutions? And do we understand in detail what these jobs are to be done? Who needs, what context, who's doing them, what does an ideal job being executed look like? And how do we then engineer these projects to best deliver those outcomes? I think looking through the other end of the telescope is the way to reveal how value is seen and experienced by citizens. And what usually will come from that is a recognition that A, we could be improving what we deliver, but secondly, that there are a lot of common themes across projects that if you understood the job to be done, could be brought together in much more compelling packages. And especially in a digital era, because this is one of the things that perhaps less understood, is that digital is not just a way of doing what we used to do better and quicker. It's a way of completely rethinking what we're trying to do using digital tools. And digital is also a form of glue that takes what was separately or historically separate and distinct things to package them and pull them together in ways that are much more powerful and empowering for citizens. So the only way to get at what would that look like and what would the maximum value be is to do this jobs to be done thinking. I would highly recommend that this frame is put onto thinking about what these projects are and what they're looking to achieve.
I'll add one last thing to that, which is what was just said is one of the most important things that anyone could take away from here today. I'll give you an example. Who here has heard of TransferWise? Okay. It's worth over £1 billion. It was started, I can't remember exactly, about 5 years ago. In 5 years, it grew from nothing to £1 billion. The job that it does, and the job that it does today, is it allows people to transfer money across borders without a ton of fees. And the way it does that is by not transferring money across borders, because then it'd get the fees. It just lines up people who want to send money, people who want to receive money, and flips the trade. £1 billion. This is how unicorns are made. These are how billion-dollar companies are made. And this is when we look at projects, how a project goes from being a total failure to actually it's a total success.
I guess the only thing I'd add is to take the time to do that and not rush into the projects. You know, not have this, we've got to do something, we've got to start building, we've got to contract, it's take a bit of time to get it set up and get the right people behind it and on it. Yeah.
Yes.
Just wondering if anybody has come across the research carried out by the Oxford Said Business School. In terms of, they've measured 11,000 projects, showing about 40% were on budget, 7.5% on time and budget, and 0.5% time, budget, and on benefit. So my thinking is, if assuming that the value is established and the end user's requirements is identified, that does not necessarily, I mean, I've worked on a lot of government projects, that does not necessarily mean the project will be on time and budget. And that puts a lot of the people in here under pressure. So how is that going to be resolved?
So we're jumping the fence now between actually creation of the business case and the value assessment. Is anyone here a systems engineer or have a systems engineering background? There we go. So there's a V diagram that is how systems engineer assess whether or not they've achieved requirements, and it starts out by top level requirements, goes down into detailed design, then you check your detailed design, check all that, and then you end up checking your core requirements. It takes a long time, but it gets what you need. When we're talking about value here, we're talking about that top level element. When it actually comes down to the projects, we're talking about the bottom. We're talking about a defined outcome. A defined output, not a defined outcome. For example, HS2, we need to lay a lot of rail. It needs to be of certain quality, certain time frame, certain price. Not, we need to drive productivity and growth throughout the north of England, spreading from London. They're two fundamentally separate things. But to actually give you an answer on that projects element, we need to understand complexity more, because emergent effects drive a large amount of productivity and performance and predictability in large complex projects. We need to incorporate a lot more data-driven methodologies into project management. Just think about how many times you would assume a certain level of productivity, or how many times people create estimates and schedules without actually having historic evidence, for example. And we need to actually, this comes on to point, recognise that complex projects are fundamentally different than traditional waterfall projects, to the same extent that agile is different, because of the stakeholder management, because of the emerging effects that they incorporate. That would be my answer.
I just want to add to that. You mentioned those stats, 0.5% or something? Actually,
Yeah, 0.5%, yeah.
Surely, if we're spending public money to invest in services for the benefit of the public, the true measure of that is, have we delivered the maximum value we can back to the public from the public's money? So the essence of time and budget, although important, if you just abstract that out, say nothing about have we spent that public money well and delivered the maximum value. And given those figures, and I mentioned the ones earlier about innovation, that 90% doesn't achieve the outcome expected because we never understood the nature of the problem we were trying to solve. It really points to the fact that understanding that job to be done and getting the value inputs right is the most powerful and morally the only thing we could really be thinking about doing as a number one priority in terms of making sure that the money that we spend delivers the maximum value for the public and the public purse. So I would say value has got to be right at the center of that. And this is probably a displacement from traditional money and time comes first, and value is a kind of thing that may or may not get delivered in the process. And make value the number one thing that we're accountable for. And to the point where we may even sacrifice some time and money because we've delivered the maximum value. So I think this is quite, it's quite revolutionary. It's a different way of thinking about it. Value comes first and the numbers come second. But I think if we're going to truly think about how we spend public money in service of the public, getting that value equation right is the most important thing we've got to focus on.
Well, that sort of presupposes that the solution is the value, whatever it costs or however long it takes. That's not the case. I mean, there has to be a balance in terms of value. If I buy something, I may be willing to pay more for it if it's going to be there tomorrow. So that's value to me. But what I'm hearing is focus on if the right solution is provided, is not the cost and time of it is not relevant, because over the 25-year period, it will possibly be recovered.
No, I'm not saying it's not relevant, because all these stakeholder considerations are in play. So yes, there is a limit to the public purse. But value should come at the pinnacle of that decision making, where there are trade-offs and balances to be made. A project that has half a percent chance of succeeding in terms of time, money, and value isn't a good spend of the public purse. If we can achieve more value from that spend, then we should be focusing on making that the number one consideration. But bear in mind that there are limited resources and constraints around which we make those decisions. So it's simply inverting the pyramid, but not discarding the other factors. They are still important. It's just a reordering of priorities.
I probably do come at your perspective. It's a bit like the Hertzberg end, if you like. If we're going to say we're going to deliver something, we've got to deliver it on time, to budget, and to the right quality. Now, we can have a debate about the value. We might spend a bit more because it's a bit better. As you said, I want something. I want an extra feature in my car or something, but you still want the car outside to start tomorrow and do what you want it to do. But you might have spent a little bit more. So it's a different debate. It's a different place. But I think you're exactly right. We also need to get into those fundamentals of how we deliver those projects to budget, to cost, and quality, because quality is terrible at times. And on time, and that's if you like the fundamental where we've got to get to before long, because there isn't a massive purse. We've got to hit these constraints we've got, and one of the constraints is going to be for construction, if you like, is we haven't got the skills either to necessarily deliver everything that we think we're going to deliver.
Good. I'm going to draw it to a close there, but please, as I say, if you let us have your questions, we will put them to the panel and we will keep the conversation going online. I'm going to ask Paul about that in a moment. But just, I wanted to thank the panel, so please say thank you to the panel.